It was supposed to be a quiet evening inside Windsor Castle. No press, no cameras, just a few select royals gathered in silence. But what unfolded in that private chamber would shake the monarchy to its very core. The Duke of Edinburgh, in a rare moment of defiance, made a decision that would forever alter the power dynamic between Queen Camilla and Princess Catherine. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The corridors of Windsor had seen countless ceremonies, coronations, farewells, and moments that defined the destiny of a kingdom, yet none carried the eerie stillness that enveloped this one. The air was thick with unspoken tension, as the Duke, known for his iron resolve and adherence to tradition, entered the room without fanfare. Invitations had been issued discreetly, only 7 senior royals summoned. No aides, no cameras, no journalists. Even the king himself seemed uncertain about the gathering's true purpose. Camilla, poised and confident, believed it was a tribute, a ceremonial acknowledgement of her years of service beside Charles. But she was wrong. What awaited her was not praise, but punishment cloaked in royal formality. Princess Anne escorted her father in with the quiet dignity of someone who already knew what was about to unfold. The Duke's gait was deliberate, his expression carved from granite. For months, whispers had swirled through the palace of growing unease, of unseen power shifts, of deep cracks behind the gilded walls, and tonight, those whispers would become the truth. The Duke took his place at the head of the long mahogany table, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. Camilla sat near the king, her fingers clutching her clutch a little too tightly, while Catherine, seated opposite, carried a calm that was almost haunting. There was emotion in her eyes, not fear, not arrogance, but an understanding that something irreversible was about to happen. The room was lit only by the faint glow of the chandeliers, their reflections dancing on polished gold frames that once bore portraits of monarchs who made impossible choices. As the silence deepened, the Duke's voice finally broke through, low, commanding, resolute. It wasn't the tone of a man making a suggestion, but one delivering a verdict. The words that followed would forever echo through the crown's history. He spoke of duty, legacy, and the sacred trust once held by the late Queen. He reminded them that power was never a right to be claimed, but a burden to be earned. Each syllable was heavy with judgment, each pause deliberate, a master of discipline now wielding it against the very heart of his family. Camilla's confidence began to waver as she realized the direction of his words. Her smile stiffened, and her eyes darted briefly toward Charles for reassurance that never came. The Duke's hand rested on a sealed envelope before him, one that had been delivered from his private archives earlier that day. No one knew what it contained, but the gravity of its presence was undeniable. When he finally broke the seal, the shuffle of parchment was the loudest sound in the room. He began reading names, titles, responsibilities, and centuries-old patronages that had defined the moral and charitable face of the monarchy. One by one, he stripped Camilla's name from them. The tone in his voice did not falter. When he spoke of her service, he acknowledged it, but coldly, as if marking the end of a reign rather than its celebration. Then came the name that changed everything: Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her appointment was not an elevation, but a transfer, a deliberate act of restoration. At that moment, the entire room froze. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She had not asked for this. Her modesty and devotion to quiet duty were the very reasons the Duke had chosen her. She stood slowly, refusing to make eye contact, her voice trembling slightly as she whispered a protest. But the Duke silenced her with a single phrase: "The late Queen saw this in you long before I did." It was a blessing and a command. Anne's approving nod across the table sealed it in silence. Camilla's expression hardened into disbelief. This wasn't a symbolic reassignment. It was the dismantling of her public identity, the unraveling of everything she had built since stepping into the Queen's shoes. The king's face remained pale, conflicted, trapped between loyalty to his wife and the shadow of his father's authority. Even the air seemed to tremble with restrained fury. What made the moment more devastating was the finality with which the Duke concluded it. His tone was stripped of emotion, his judgment absolute. "The monarchy must remember its heart," he said, folding the parchment with care and placing it before Catherine. In those few words, he restored what he believed had been lost: dignity, restraint, and moral order. And then came the silence, a silence thicker than walls, heavier than crowns. Catherine sat motionless, the weight of history pressing upon her shoulders. Camilla's eyes glistened, not with sorrow, but with humiliation. The Duke rose, nodded once to Anne, and walked out as if his duty had finally been fulfilled. But what drove the Duke to this quiet rebellion was not a moment's impulse. It was years of buried tension, private grievances, and silent humiliation that had finally reached the breaking point. Behind the royal facade of unity, the Duke of Edinburgh carried wounds that time never healed. Camilla had risen fast, too fast, assuming patronages, titles, and privileges once protected by the late Queen. For Duke, it wasn't upgrading. It was a mockery. What Camilla saw as progress, he saw as the dismantling of the monarchy's moral backbone. For decades, the Duke had lived by a strict code of duty. To him, every title held meaning, every patronage carried weight, and every decision echoed through the legacy of the crown. He had watched Queen Elizabeth dedicate her life to maintaining the sanctity of royal service, never for popularity, never for personal gain, but for something sacred and enduring. When Camilla began to expand her influence after the coronation, quietly collecting patronages once held by Elizabeth herself, it wasn't simply an act of ambition. It was, in the Duke's eyes, a rewriting of history. And the one thing the Duke could never tolerate was the corruption of legacy. The tension started subtly, buried under layers of polite smiles and royal decorum. The Duke rarely voiced his disapproval publicly. He didn't need to. His silence was sharp enough to cut through the palace walls. Those close to him knew that behind his calm exterior lay a storm of discontent. Camilla's new patronages were not mere honorary gestures. They were symbols of authority, markers of status, and most importantly, replacements for the late Queen's enduring legacy. It was as if her memory was being slowly overwritten, replaced by a woman the Duke still viewed as an outsider in the grand lineage of Windsor tradition. Princess Anne felt tension before anyone. Having inherited her father's steel and her mother's restraint, Anne became increasingly uncomfortable with Camilla's growing dominance over the royal schedule. There were whispered disagreements about who should attend certain events, which charities should remain under whose care, and whether Camilla was overstepping the silent lines of protocol. It was never outright confrontation yet, but the undertone of rivalry became impossible to ignore. The Duke watched it all with mounting concern, feeling as though the royal code he had sworn to protect was being twisted into something unrecognizable. In private, he found comfort in Catherine. Her quiet humility reminded him of Elizabeth, her discipline, her composure, and her instinctive understanding that power was not worn but carried. Unlike Camilla, Catherine never sought the spotlight. She seemed to resist it, and that resistance earned her something more valuable than approval. It earned her respect. The Duke admired the way Catherine carried herself, silent, steadfast, never reactive, never self-serving. To him, she embodied the monarchy as it was meant to be gracious, yet unyielding. Among the Duke's personal papers, there were notes, fragments of conversations he once shared with the Queen long before her passing. In one, she had written, "We must always preserve the heart, not the image, of the crown." Those words stayed with him, haunting him through every photograph of Camilla smiling beside Charles, as though she had finally conquered the role destiny once denied her. To the Duke, it wasn't destiny at all. It was an intrusion, and the more he saw Charles surrender to his wife's influence, the deeper his disappointment grew. He began to speak of it in confidence with Anne, hinting that the monarchy was losing its moral compass. The king's decisions were no longer his own. They were carefully crafted around Camilla's ambitions. For a man who had spent his entire life defining discipline, that realization cut deep. The Duke had always seen the monarchy as a sacred trust between the sovereign and the people. But now, it was becoming something political, something performative. He could not stand idly by as the crown turned into theatre. It was during one quiet afternoon at Balmoral that the final spark was lit. The Duke received word quietly, discreetly, that Camilla had plans to claim one of the late Queen's most cherished patronages, a foundation that symbolized Elizabeth's lifelong commitment to the nation's moral conscience. To outsiders, it was just another honor. For Duke, it was a line crossed. The memory of his wife's reign was not something to be divided, traded, or rebranded for convenience. It was sacred ground. So when whispers reached the Duke that Camilla planned to claim one of the late Queen's most sacred patronages, he decided it was time to act, even if it meant tearing open royal wounds before the entire family. For years, Camilla had been the quiet architect of her own rise, mastering charm, manipulation, and timing. But power built on influence, not legitimacy, eventually cracks. The Duchess turned Queen found herself cornered by those she underestimated the most: the Duke of Edinburgh, Anne, and Catherine. The same trio that once defended her inclusion, now prepared to dismantle her empire piece by piece. The tension inside the palace had begun to thicken like a fog no one could escape. Once, Camilla's word had carried weight, whispered through corridors, and swiftly executed without question. But now, something has changed. There was a quiet rebellion brewing beneath the surface. Not loud, not reckless, but patient and deliberate. Palace staff, who once answered eagerly to Camilla's every demand, now seemed hesitant, their loyalties shifting silently toward Catherine. The difference was stark. Where Camilla commanded through fear and expectation, Catherine inspired through grace and restraint. And in a place where perception often outweighs truth, that shift alone was deadly. Behind closed doors, murmurs of discontent began to surface. Senior aides, who had grown weary of Camilla's dominance, found themselves gravitating toward the more balanced and compassionate leadership embodied by the Princess of Wales. They spoke in coded phrases, a return to dignity, a rebalancing of priorities, but everyone knew what they meant. The heart of the monarchy was shifting. Camilla could feel it in every cold glance, every hushed conversation that ended the moment she entered the room. Her authority, once absolute, now felt fragile, a crown that no longer fit as securely as it once did. Then came the leak of a document that sent tremors through Buckingham Palace. An internal memo had surfaced suggesting that several of Camilla's long-held patronages were being reviewed for reallocation, with a significant number proposed to be transferred to Catherine. It was unsigned, without an official seal, but the message was unmistakable. Someone inside the inner circle had made their move. For the first time since ascending beside Charles, Camilla sensed that her reign was no longer being quietly supported but strategically dismantled. The Duke of Edinburgh's involvement was an open secret among those who paid attention. He had always been precisely a man who rarely wasted words, but made each one count. His alignment with Anne only made matters worse for Camilla. The two shared a mutual understanding and devotion to the monarchy's moral fabric that transcended politics or favoritism. To them, Camilla's approach wasn't modernization, it was corrosion. They saw her as someone who turned tradition into performance, and performance into control. That belief forged an alliance rooted in preservation, not progress. And yet, the most dangerous threat Camilla faced wasn't from the Duke or Anne. It was from Catherine's quiet refusal to play the same game. In moments where she could have claimed authority, Catherine chose humility instead. When offered certain ceremonial titles, she declined them out of respect for Her Majesty. That one phrase, humble, reverent, and deliberate, spread through the press like wildfire. It painted her not just as the moral heir to Queen Elizabeth's spirit, but as the embodiment of the very dignity the public longed for. It was a masterstroke, though unplanned, and it terrified Camilla more than any open challenge ever could. In her private moments, paranoia began to take root. She saw conspiracies in every delayed message, betrayal in every polite smile. Her confidence fractured under the weight of suspicion. The woman who once orchestrated her ascent through subtle manipulation now found herself surrounded by silence. She couldn't interpret. The Duke's cold composure unnerved her. Anne's quiet distance infuriated her. Catherine's calm restraint haunted her. Every move she made seemed to strengthen their unity, Every attempt to assert control only deepened her isolation. The cracks in Camilla's influence were no longer invisible. They were widening, spreading across the foundations of her carefully constructed empire. The same courtiers who once defended her as a symbol of modern strength now whispered of arrogance, of overreach, of a crown losing its grace. The queen consort had become a figure of controversy within her own walls, not because of scandal, but because she had lost what every monarch needs to survive: loyalty. The palace itself seemed to shift in tone. Meetings grew colder, gestures more formal, and silences more loaded. The storm was not yet visible to the world, but within the royal walls, everyone could feel the gathering pressure. The Duke had set the plan in motion, Anne had fortified it, and Catherine, without a word, had unknowingly become its living symbol. The royal court could sense something monumental was coming, and when the ceremony began, Camilla's greatest fear would no longer be gossip. It would be reality. The air in the chamber turned heavy as the Duke rose from his chair, clutching a velvet case that carried the emblems of royal patronage. He turned not to King Charles, but Catherine. Gasps filled the room. In that single, defiant act, he made his intentions unmistakable. The true guardian of the Queen's legacy was not Camilla, but the woman who embodied her spirit with grace and quiet strength. What happened next unfolded with the solemn weight of history. The Duke's hand trembled slightly as he placed the case upon the table before Catherine. Decades of royal tradition hung in that moment. His voice, though aged and weathered, carried the authority of a man who had once stood beside a queen and now sought to defend her memory. These were entrusted to those who upheld duty above desire, he declared, his tone steady yet charged with emotion. Every word echoed through the hall like a command from the past, as though Queen Elizabeth herself were speaking through him. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Charles remained motionless, unable to disguise the turmoil in his expression, torn between his wife's humiliation and his father's moral finality. Catherine, however, looked stunned. Her instinct was to refuse. She shook her head gently, whispering words that carried both respect and resistance. "I am not worthy to take what belongs to Her Majesty's memory," she said softly. The Duke's eyes met hers with an unflinching gaze. "You already have," he replied, the words heavy with symbolism. It was not flattery, nor favour. It was recognition, the kind earned not through ambition, but through quiet integrity. It was the passing of something far greater than a title, the spiritual guardianship of the monarchy itself. Anne, seated nearby, watched in silence. For years, she had been the unwavering pillar of royal duty, loyal to her mother, skeptical of outsiders, protective of the monarchy's core. Yet, in that moment, her eyes softened. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent approval that spoke louder than any speech could. To those in the room, it was clear, the Duke was not acting alone. This was the will of a generation that refused to let the crown's meaning be diluted by power politics. It was a reassertion of the moral code that defined the monarchy for centuries, one that placed honour above hierarchy. As Catherine hesitated, her hands hovering over the velvet case, the Duke began to open it. Inside were several emblems, symbols of royal patronage once worn by the late Queen and later claimed by Camilla. Each carried its own weight of history, a crest for endurance, a seal for compassion, a medallion for service. To the Duke, these were not trinkets or ceremonial ornaments. They were reminders of the values that built the monarchy. "These belong to one who serves, not rules," he murmured, his voice breaking slightly under the emotion. Catherine's eyes glistened as she realized the magnitude of what he was asking. Camilla's composure shattered in silence. Her face drained of color as she realized the symbolism of what was happening. Her name, once etched beside these patronages, was being quietly erased from the registry. She had spent years climbing the fragile ladder of royal approval, and in one moment, the Duke had undone it all without a single accusation. This was not punishment through words or scandal. It was erased through honor, a form of justice far more devastating than any public rebuke. Charles's eyes darted between them, his conflict palpable. He understood what this meant, not just for his reign, but for his family's unity. To oppose his father now would appear as defiance against legacy itself, yet to support him would wound his wife beyond repair. Catherine sensed his pain. When her gaze finally met his, there was no triumph in it, only quiet sorrow. She did not want this power, yet she could not refuse it without dishonoring the man who had stood for everything the monarchy was built upon. That brief exchange between them, wordless, respectful, and heartbreaking, carried the full gravity of their intertwined fates. The Duke closed the case and placed it before Catherine with finality. "Protect what she built," he said simply, referring to the late Queen. Catherine nodded, her voice barely audible as she accepted the charge, not as a gift, but as a burden. For her, it was no victory. It was inheritance heavy, sacred, and irreversible. Around them, the royal family sat frozen, each lost in thought. Camilla's eyes burned with disbelief, Anne's with pride, and Charles's with regret. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the past had returned to witness this silent passing of the crown's conscience. The Duke's act was noble and dangerous, a decision made not for politics, but for truth. But every gesture in that room carried a hidden cost, and the Duke's decision, though noble, would ignite a royal war that no one could contain. No cameras captured it, but those who heard the echoes said it was unlike anything they'd ever witnessed. Camilla's rage erupted like thunder. For the first time since her coronation, she lost control, screaming about betrayal, legacy, and humiliation. What she didn't realize was that her every word was being quietly noted, documented, and eventually leaked by someone she trusted most. The walls of Clarence House, once the setting of her triumphs, became the stage of her unraveling. Hours after the ceremony, she stormed into her private quarters, her fury shaking the fragile calm of the palace. Her voice, usually measured and careful, now tore through the silence. "They humiliated me," she shouted, "and you said nothing." The target of her rage was King Charles. His silence at the ceremony had not only exposed her vulnerability, but also made her feel abandoned by the one man who had promised to stand beside her through every trial. Charles, weary and defeated, did not answer at first. He simply looked at her with the expression of a man who had seen his empire splinter in front of him and didn't know which side to protect. The confrontation escalated quickly. Glass shattered against marble floors, doors slammed, and the staff, trained to remain invisible, could not help but overhear fragments of a royal argument that felt more human than regal. Camilla accused Charles of cowardice, of betraying her in front of the family, and of allowing the Duke to strip away what she had built piece by piece. "You watched them take it from me," she screamed, her words trembling with rage. "You let her replace me." For Charles, each accusation was a dagger. He tried to calm her, to explain that it wasn't as simple as betrayal or victory, that the Duke's actions carried a moral gravity he could not challenge without shaming his mother's legacy. But logic was useless against the storm that had already been unleashed. Behind the heavy curtains of secrecy, someone else was listening to a confidant close to Camilla, one who had served her faithfully for years. Perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps out of survival, that individual began recording the aftermath of her outburst, the words that would soon find their way beyond those walls. The recording revealed not just anger, but desperation. In it, Camilla threatened to withdraw entirely from public life, claiming that if she was not respected as queen consort, she would no longer serve the monarchy at all. It was a line that shook even her inner circle. For a woman who had fought so fiercely to earn her place, to speak of abandoning it altogether revealed just how deeply the Duke's decision had cut her. Meanwhile, the king stood caught between impossible loyalties. His sister, Anne, had made her stance painfully clear. Her loyalty lay with tradition, not sentiment. She had already warned Catherine privately to stay out of sight, knowing that Camilla's humiliation could easily turn into retaliation. The Duke's decision had created an invisible divide, and Charles now stood at its center, trying and failing to reconcile two worlds that could no longer coexist. Every word he said to Camilla sounded hollow, every attempt at comfort twisted into justification for her public disgrace. By morning, The palace corridors buzzed with unspoken tension. The staff restrained, but whispers filled the air. Reporters outside began to notice subtle changes: the removal of Camilla's name from several charity pages, and the quiet disappearance of her title from the royal website's patronage list. To the public, it seemed like a technical glitch. To those inside, it was the beginning of a crisis spiraling out of control. Monarchy had entered damage control mode, yet the wound was already too deep to conceal. As the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, Charles found himself haunted by the echo of his wife's words. "You, let her replace me." He couldn't deny what the world was already sensing. The nation's affection was shifting once more, aligning with the quiet grace of Catherine, the figure now seen as the rightful inheritor of the Queen's spirit. And though Camilla's fury had subsided into silence, that silence was far more dangerous. Because beneath the chaos of that night, an even deeper truth was beginning to surface, one that traced back to a private promise made between the Duke and the late Queen herself. In a sealed letter found among the Duke's personal belongings, a message from the late Queen surfaced, a quiet directive written in her own hand. It spoke of legacy, not politics. "Guard the crown's heart," she wrote. Those who knew her best understood immediately what that meant. The Duke's decision wasn't an act of rebellion, it was obedience to his Queen's final wish. Finding that letter changed everything. Hidden within a leather-bound folder, its ink slightly faded but the meaning painfully clear, it revealed the depth of the Queen's foresight. She had seen the storm coming long before it broke. The monarchy she built with patience and principle was at risk of crumbling under the weight of ambition and ego. "Guard the crown's heart" was not merely a sentimental note, but a warning disguised as a request. And for the Duke, those words became his compass. Every decision he made in his later years, including the quiet ceremony that stripped Camilla's patronages, was rooted in that final promise. To him, the crown's heart represented something sacred, not gold, not blood, but virtue. It was the moral pulse of the monarchy, the invisible line that separated service from self-interest. The Queen had always believed that the true measure of royalty was not found in power or privilege, but in restraint. She feared what might happen if the throne ever lost its humility, if it became more about dominance than duty. The Duke understood that fear better than anyone. In Catherine, he saw a reflection of that lost balance, a woman whose grace carried the same quiet authority that had once defined Elizabeth herself. She didn't chase attention, it followed her naturally. She didn't demand reverence, she earned it through silence and steadiness. To the Duke, she was the living embodiment of his wife's words. The more he compared Catherine's quiet dignity with Camilla's visible hunger for influence, the more convinced he became that the Queen had foreseen this divide. Her letter mentioned no names, but its intent was unmistakable. She had trusted that someone, perhaps her husband, would one day recognize who truly carried her legacy forward. That realization haunted the Duke. It explained his relentless protectiveness over Catherine, his subtle but deliberate acts to ensure she remained shielded from palace politics. In her, he saw the crown's continuity unbroken, pure, and incorruptible. But for Camilla, that letter was a wound that would never heal. When word of its existence reached her, she dismissed it as manipulation, insisting it was being used to undermine her position. Yet deep down, she knew the truth. The Queen had never fully trusted her. Camilla had spent years trying to rewrite her image, to prove that she could bear the weight of the crown with dignity. But no matter how carefully she crafted her public persona, she could not replicate Elizabeth's humility, the quiet power that came not from control, but from self-sacrifice. That difference, more than anything, defined the growing fracture between her and the rest of the family. Anne, who had rarely spoken of her mother's private wishes, finally broke her silence after reading the letter. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she told Catherine, "Mother always knew you were meant for this." It wasn't a declaration of favoritism, but of understanding. The Queen, she explained, had seen in Catherine the one thing no modern figure possessed: balance, the ability to be royal without becoming untouchable, to command respect without demanding it. That single quality was what the monarchy needed most, and what Camilla could never emulate. The letter's contents soon became the silent foundation for the Duke's defiance. To outsiders, his actions seemed driven by pride or nostalgia, but those who understood the man knew better. He was honoring a promise one made in love, forged in loyalty, and executed in grief. The Queen's final request was not about succession or symbolism. It was about saving the monarchy's soul before it was too late. But even as the Queen's words echoed through the family, not everyone was willing to surrender the throne of influence so quietly, least of all Camilla herself. Within days, Windsor and Clarence House became battlefields of loyalty. Staff, courtiers, and senior aides whispered in corridors, choosing sides without saying a word. Camilla began holding secret meetings with her allies, while Catherine withdrew into silence, refusing to retaliate. The Duke's actions had not just shifted power, they had fractured it. The monarchy was now two palaces, one crown and no peace. The calm that once defined royal routine was gone. Every glance, every delay in communication, carried meaning. The once unified household now operated like rival courts, each side carefully watching the other's moves. Internal emails, normally full of ceremonial scheduling, began to carry undertones of rivalry. Instructions were revised, events quietly postponed, and behind each change was a question: who truly spoke for the crown now? The Duke's act of defiance had not only altered royal tradition, it had exposed the fragility of an institution built on silence and perception. Leaks began to emerge. First small, almost insignificant rumors of strained conversations, subtle protocol breaches, and staff resignations. But soon, whispers turned to headlines. The press began reporting on growing unrest inside the palace, hinting at a power struggle between two women who represented two visions of monarchy. Camilla's inner circle moved quickly to regain control, arranging new public appearances to project stability. She smiled for the cameras, spoke of unity, and pretended nothing had changed. But those who looked closely could see the unease behind her eyes. The Queen Consort was no longer dictating the narrative, she was reacting to it. Catherine, on the other hand, chose silence, and in that silence, she found strength. She declined interviews, ignored speculation, and carried on with her duties as though untouched by the chaos. The media interpreted her restraint as grace, and the public followed suit. Commentators began drawing parallels between Catherine's quiet dignity and the late Queen's timeless composure. That comparison alone was enough to tip public sentiment. The woman once seen as the monarchy's modern face now seemed its moral centre. Her refusal to engage made her untouchable. King Charles, however, could not retreat into silence. His exhaustion was visible in every rare public appearance. The weight of balancing loyalty to his wife with his duty to uphold his father's legacy was breaking him down. He avoided statements, postponed engagements, and withdrew from the public eye under the guise of rest. Behind palace doors, he had become the king in name only, a man surrounded by voices pulling him in opposite directions. The monarchy he had waited a lifetime to inherit was slipping beyond his grasp, one decision at a time. Princess Anne, ever pragmatic, became the quiet stabilizer in the storm. She neither condemned nor defended, but instead acted as the invisible thread holding the crown together. She mediated conversations no one else could manage, and reminded both sides with firm but measured words that duty must outweigh ego. Her loyalty, as always, remained with the institution itself, not the individuals who temporarily wore its titles. In private, however, even she admitted to close aides that the Duke's decision had exposed something irreversible. The royal family was no longer unified by blood, it was divided by belief. As days turned into weeks, the palace's internal chaos began spilling into the public sphere. Journalists who had long been shut out of royal affairs suddenly found their phones ringing with anonymous tips. Memos, transcripts, even private meeting summaries began circulating through the media. The crown's walls of secrecy were cracking, and no one could identify where the leaks were coming from. Yet the impact was unmistakable. Catherine's image soared, while Camilla's began to falter. Polls showed overwhelming public support for the Princess of Wales as the rightful face of the future. It was a subtle coup, not of thrones or titles, but of hearts and perception. Every attempt by Camilla's team to reassert her position only made the contrast sharper. She appeared defensive, while Catherine appeared serene. One embodied struggle, the other, grace. And within that contrast, the monarchy's balance shifted further toward the woman the Duke had chosen to honor. Inside Windsor, tension reached a quiet breaking point. The king's advisors warned that another scandal could destroy what little credibility remained. But before anyone could repair the damage, an even greater revelation was about to surface, one that would expose the depth of the Duke's planning and prove that his final act had been far from spontaneous. Because the final blow would not come from the palace corridors, it would come from the press, who uncovered something the Duke had planned long before his final act. When the Duke's legal team unsealed his final will, one clause stunned even his closest confidants. Hidden within his estate provisions was a written declaration that every royal patronage under his name be transferred to the one who bears the late Queen's spirit. There was no legal technicality. It was his final statement to the monarchy. Honor, humility, and history now belonged to Catherine, not Camilla. The revelation sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. For decades, the Duke had been the monarchy's silent anchor, a man of principle who rarely left behind written words. Yet here, in his final moments, he had spoken louder than ever. His decision was not about inheritance or estate, it was about identity. With a single clause, he had redefined what it meant to serve the crown, reaffirming that lineage and loyalty were not enough without integrity. His intent was unmistakable to ensure that the values of Queen Elizabeth would live on through Catherine, the woman who carried the same unshakable devotion to duty that the late monarch had embodied. Legal experts called it unprecedented. Though the will carried no direct constitutional consequence, its symbolic power was undeniable. It wasn't about wealth or titles, it was about moral succession. By publicly transferring his royal patronages, the Duke had created a moment that transcended law and entered legend. The crown's moral authority, once questioned by years of internal conflict and public scandal, was suddenly being restored in the most unexpected way, not by a king or a decree, but by the final words of a man whose loyalty to truth had never wavered. The media seized upon the revelation with relentless fervor. Front pages declared it the Duke's last act of loyalty, framing it as a generational reckoning. Catherine was hailed as the People's Queen, a title that seemed to emerge not from aspiration but from destiny itself. Her composure after the chaos only deepened public admiration. She neither claimed the honor nor commented on it, yet her silence spoke volumes. To the people, she represented something sacred, the return of grace, the revival of the quiet strength that had once defined the British monarchy. The contrast between her restraint and Camilla's wounded defiance could not have been starker. For Camilla, the will's contents were a final humiliation, a haunting confirmation that her influence built through years of careful maneuvering was slipping through her fingers. Public sympathy had vanished. Where she once commanded cautious respect, she now faced whispers of betrayal, her image overshadowed by Catherine's rising prominence. Every attempt at public engagement seemed to falter. Her words felt forced, her appearances rehearsed. The nation had made up its mind. Whatever power she once held had now been symbolically and irrevocably taken from her. King Charles's response was far more restrained but equally revealing. He made no official statement, nor did he seek to challenge his father's final wishes. Those close to him noted a quiet resignation, a recognition that the balance of power within his own family had shifted beyond his control. For Charles, it was a painful reminder that even a king must sometimes yield to the moral authority of legacy. He knew what the public saw now, not two women in conflict, but two visions of monarchy, one rooted in reverence, the other in reputation. The Duke's will had made clear which one the world would remember. Within the palace, the ripple effects were profound. Advisors who once aligned themselves with Camilla began pivoting toward Catherine, understanding that history favored continuity over controversy. The Duke's act had become more than a personal declaration. It was a moral reset for the monarchy. The institution that had wavered under modern scrutiny was finding its equilibrium again. not through power, but through principle. Catherine's presence restored a sense of calm the monarchy had not felt in 50 years, quiet, dignified, and deeply reminiscent of the era of Queen Elizabeth herself. Outside the palace gates, the nation responded in kind. Candlelight vigils appeared in Windsor, handwritten notes bearing messages of gratitude to the Duke for protecting the Queen's legacy. Polls showed overwhelming support for Catherine's expanding role, marking a turning point in public faith toward the monarchy. What began as a private family decision had evolved into a national reflection on what the crown truly represented. Not authority, but accountability. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.